All right, so we're COMP3026, and this is Application Security Programming, and we're on part 3 of week 3, lesson 3. And we've talked about a couple things. I tried unsuccessfully. I love failing, eh? I tried unsuccessfully to prove Stephen wrong, but it's okay. It's good. Failure, you learn more from failure a lot of times than you do from success, right? I would say always. So, so the great thing is we're going to continue, and I will update you guys next week on this one. But I really do want to talk about a little bit about controllers, because we have to understand, we have to start getting into this MVC stuff that we've been speaking of for the last little while, and show you some examples of this. And I'm just going to reduce this a little bit so we can see. Okay, so I'm going to move between these two things here. I'm going to keep Azure up and running, right? So here's Azure, and I'm going to keep our Visual Studio here. We're going to create a new project. I'm going to close my solution, and eventually I'll be able to clean all that stuff up that I did today. I'm going to go to new project, and I want you guys to follow along with me in your favorite version of Visual Studio, whether it's online in your VM or locally, right? And I want you to create we're going to go with a web application, but we're going to do a full-blown ASP.NET MVC5 application. So we're going to say, we're going to call this COMP3026, and it'll be lesson 3, part 3. And I'm going to create a GitHub repository for that as well. And this is what I would have to have checked off. If you notice, add application insights to project. This is checked off on my side. I don't like it. For the same reasons that Aaron doesn't like it, it causes issues. I'm going to press OK. No cloud. I'm going to deploy the other way now. There's going to be 3 ways we're going to show deployment today. The first way, which is what you did, right? Second way, which is GitHub. And the third way, which is my way, another way that I'm going to do right now, right? So I'm going to go MVC, right? And if you notice, I'm not hosting in the cloud yet. I'm going to press OK. Okay, so I'm going to let this thing do its thing. It's going to build out its scaffold for this MVC project, right, fairly quickly. And there I am, and just from a test perspective, let's just test that this MVC project works. And clickety-click barber trick. It's all working, right? Okay, well, there's a couple things to note. So if I was going to look at the MVC structure again, you notice that we have controllers. We have controllers that are CS files, C# files, right? We also have several views, right? And the views, of course, are managed. The controllers manage the views. We'll talk about that a little bit today. But like it says in our PowerPoint presentation here that I'm going to be putting together in a second, come on. There I am. It's really kind of a chicken and the egg scenario, right? I want to be talking about MVC, right? So like Kevin said last week, I want to talk about models, views, and controllers because they're all linked together. It's like I can't talk about one without talking about the others, like you said, right? So today we're going to talk about controllers first. Next week it's going to be models and views. The reason for that is because you kind of need one to talk about the other, right? So we talked about what they are, right? They're responsible for responding to user input, right? That's what they do. And they basically say, so what do I want? I want to kind of flow the data from my model, which is my business logic that attaches to the database, right, into my view. That's what I'm doing with the controller. The controller is like the middleman, if you will, right? He or she is going to decide, I'll say she, because we'll call the controller Vanessa. My Vanessa controller, right? She's going to control, right, the view and the model. She's going to look at the model and say, okay, I need this data. And you know what? I'm going to take this data and I'm going to round trip it and send it right to the view. So here's my request from the user. It's, again, this is the whole request response kind of idea, right? It's going to come to the controller through the view, right? It's going to go out to the model, get the right data, and send it back to the view, this round trip idea. Okay. Now in MVC, right, the one thing you have to know from a .NET perspective, again, that's why it says it's kind of a, a 3-part model, right? You can't really talk one or the other. That's why it says it's kind of a chicken and egg scenario, right? You have to really talk about views and models anyway. So let's talk about this idea of this home controller. So think about this. You've got the controllers we have today, right? If I go back to my application, I've got these 3 controllers that are built into my MVC scaffold, right? I've got my home controller, I've got my account controller, and my manage controller. Let's go into my home controller for a second and take a look what it is, right? In my home controller, I've got some methods that are part of my controller. And if you notice, my controller is a class, right? This is where it's a little bit more organized in some ways than Angular. If you remember the Angular MVC pattern, if you've taken that or investigated that at all, if you notice here, I've got my action, action result, action result, action result, and I've got 3 different signatures, if you will, right? Or I've got my index here. Sorry, I've got my index. That's my method. I've got my about, that's my method, and my contact, that's my method. But the output, this is what's returned, is an action result. And what am I returning? I'm returning a view. Here's my view, 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 view. These views, right, are going to be returned based on my output. And look at what I'm getting here. My view bag dot message, in this particular case, we'll talk about views next week, is your application description page. That's what I get when I hit my about page, right? And my contact is your contacts page. That's what I'm going to get output from my home controller. So my home controller is going to say, depending on which route that I'm getting, right, what's my route request? My request is coming inbound to say, I want to get the index page, right? Well, if I'm going to get the index page, I'm going to return my default view. If I want to get my about page, I'm going to change my message, and this is a view bag. View bag is just an example of just an object that we have a message property to. We're going to return different messages according to which website, which route we're going to, right? Going back to that whole routing aspect. So that's what really the home controller is about. The home controller, the account controller is very similar to the home controller. I'm just going to get back here. As I do the same thing, Aaron, I have to switch back to which view can be seen when I record. Take care, Mike. My account controller is responsible for account-related requests. Again, logging in and account registration. Those are the 2 things. Whereas my home controller takes care of the home page, and it's the root website, the about page, and the contact page are linked to the home controller. So each controller takes care of different pages. That's what it's all about. The challenge when understanding MVC pattern is understanding, well, where does all this fit in, right? Because when you see this first scaffold, when you look at the scaffold MVC, you're like, holy crap, there's a lot of files. What do they all do? It's the same thing if you use Yeoman in Angular as an example, and you get a scaffold that's generated, right? You're like, hey, what does this scaffold do in Node? You don't understand. You have to go investigate. And that's what we're going to be doing over the next couple weeks, this week and next week. So this is what you get as a default for your home controller. You get this action result, action result, action result. That's the return type, action result. I can change this return type to whatever I want, though. I don't have to make it action result. We'll talk about that in a second. So let's talk about how we do that. So if I want to make my own controller, I want to call something a store controller. So how do we do this? We're going to right-click on the controllers. We're going to do this right now. We're going to make a new store controller. And we're going to add controller as a menu item. Let's do that. So I'm going to go over here to Solution Explorer. Follow me, guys, so we can do this together. I'm going to add a new controller here. So I'm going to right-click on controllers. I'm going to go Add. And in here, I'm going to extend the functionality of my basic website to add in an additional controller. I'm going to go to New Item. I'll do it that way too. Right? It basically tells, it detects where I'm at because it's an ASP.NET folder type, so it knows what I can add in. So add, I can do controller or add new item. Let's go to new item to show you that way as well. Right? So if I look at it here, here's my web API controller. Is that the one? No. It is, well, here they did controller, that's the one that's on top here. But actually, if you go to add new item, you can do it from here as well. So let's find it. Where is this controller? And of course, I can search for it. So I'm going to say controller. Right? Yes, I can add Angular controllers as well if I want to. Here's my web API controller class, and I guess this is the only one that I could add in. Isn't that interesting? That sucks. I'll do it this way. What was that? Do you? I don't. It might just be my install. So I'm going to go just add controller, like it says here. When I do that, it's going to give me my different options. There's an empty controller, right? And I'm just going to go with this thing right here. Oops, go back. Oops, here it is. Here's my empty controller is what I want to add in. So I'm going to go click empty controller and click add. And I can change this to, if you notice, it defaults, so the default is highlighted. So I can name my controller something controller, whatever it's called. Here we're going to call it a store controller because we're going to create an e-commerce site. Store controller, add. And what it does is it adds an empty store controller. And if I double click on it, it looks like just like this, right? So I have got each controller has its own index and everything else, and those have special names. We're going to talk about that in a second. So again, it's I can also add additional methods, right, to do that. And what I want to do is I want to handle the browse. If I want to browse for my store, right, and I want to have details, I can add those two methods, right? We'll talk about that in a second, right? So each of these methods, depending on the route, are going to respond with different views. That's the whole idea here, right? Now I haven't created the views, and this is the whole chicken and the egg thing. This is where we're going to change our response. Instead of it being an action response, we're going to get back a string or whatever you want. You can return whatever you like, right? So let's try that. So inside, in the controller itself, we're going to change the signature of the index method to return a string rather than an action result. That's the first thing we're going to do. So we're going to make it so it looks like this. So public string index, and then we're going to return hello from whatever store index as an example. So let's do that. So here's my action result. I'm going to change this to string, right? And then instead of returning a view, which doesn't make any sense anymore, it's going to error out right now, I can return a string literal, which is hello from. Yes?
Sort of short, not really related, but if in your manage Azure panel there, you asked us to turn off our VMs, but if you click all running items, there's about 6 items running there. Do we have to shut down?
No.
Just the VM?
Yeah, those other items are like storage items and stuff like that. You don't turn those off.
So those won't go through.
As far as I know, they don't eat money like VMs do.
All right.
Store.index. So hello from store.index. And the reason why we're putting that in there is because just to show which of my my routes are being returned here. That's what this is doing, right? I guess the first piece that we're going to do. The second piece is we're going to add a store.browse action, right, that returns hello from store.browse, and a store.details action that returns hello from store.details. So how do we do that, right? So here's a bunch of different actions. That's what they're called, right? So really, if you notice the comments here, right, you're getting a get result. This is perfectly exactly like Node. If you remember Node, if you've learned Node at all, you're doing a get request, right? Here's the route store, right? And it's returning for this store. It's returning this index. If you're going to store browse, right? And all I'm doing is I can create additional methods that I'm creating here that return different routes: index, browse, details, and so on. And we can name them whatever we want, which is super flexible and way easier than doing Node. Right, Node's got a little bit more challenge involved. So let's do that. So I'm going to kind of copy and paste these. So I'm going to say this is store, and there's another one, and one more, right? So we'll call this browse, right? So it'll be almost like the root will be browse, right? And this will be details, right? So store details. This will be the root for it right here. So if you notice store.index, this is store.browse, and this is store.details. Right, so that's our controller that we've created, right? Okay, and when we run the project, if we go to store now, right, or store browse or store details, we'll get this as a return. It'll return a string, not a view, right? That's what the idea here is. So let's run this thing and see if I'm right. So again, I go to my basic page. Now I don't have any navigation to take me there right now, so I have to do it manually, just like I would with Node, right? So here's localhost, and if I go here and I type in the word store, right, then I get hello from store index. This is my route. And if I go store browse, right, I've created my routing. Oh, not browser, browse. So, I mean, I don't have a browser. There's browse, and I get a store details. Right? I get all those returns. So all the routes are returning back details of whatever I want. Now, typically we talk about views. We haven't talked about views yet. We're going to talk about that next week, and this is where the whole chicken and the egg comes in. We don't know about views. We don't know how to generate these views. We don't know how to generate. We don't know how to use a view engine necessarily. So how can we work with views if we don't know how to do them? But right now, I want you to figure out and remember, when we create controllers, it's this simple. Our controller is truly the simplest controllers talk about routing data from a request to a response. Here's my request I'm getting from the user to go to a specific route. Here's my view that I'm responding with, and my view is going to handle the business logic connecting to my model. Okay.
What about parameters?
Let's talk about that a little bit. So here's my parameters in controller actions, right? So again, if I want to change my browse action method to retrieve a query string, right, from the URL, I can add something called a genre parameter of type string to your action method, right? So here's an example of that. So here's my public string browse, right? And then I use a string, and I call it genre. So my genre will be the type of, something that I'm looking for in my store. So an example, if I'm searching for disco, that's my genre for music, right? Because I have a store that sells music, right? Then I can actually say my string message is http utility.html encode, and then store.browse genre is equal to, and so on. And what this long string message does, I can return this as a message, because this message is returned, right? Because that's what I'm returning. If I browse for genre, and if you notice, this is what the string is going to be, right? It's going to interpret this. It's going to say if it's a genre, right? Whatever it is, whatever the genre is, and if it's a disco, that's what the genre is. It's going to pass this item disco into the genre, this variable. It's going to pass this in here, and it's going to say store browse genre is equal to disco. That's all it's going to say. An HTTP utility, HTML encode, we'll talk about that later on as we move forward. But all it's doing is taking this information and it's encoding it as an HTML output, right? That's the first piece. And this is what you're going to get. Store browse genre is equal to disco, right? And that's really it in a nutshell, right? So really controllers, if I was going to leave you with this little tidbit for today, controllers, I want you to think about them as how do we respond to a request? It goes back to a request response. Here's my request for the specific route, just like we did in Angular. If you've done Angular before, or any other kind of express routing or whatever, you get a request, and then you return a response. The response could be, in this case, a string. Tomorrow, when we talk next week, it's going to be a view. All right, and we're going to use a specific view engine called Razor that we're going to use for our to return our views. We can also use HTML type views, and there's other view engines out there we can use as well. Razor is just the standard one that you get with MVC from Microsoft. And that's it for me for this week, guys.